Everyone see that? Great. Thank you. All right, we're going to give folks just a little more time to get logged on here, but a couple housekeeping things. Please just try and stay muted during the presentation so we don't have lots of background noise going on. If you have questions, you can type them into the chat box and we'll get to those. Most of them we'll get to at the end of the discussion, and we'll also have more time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And any links and stuff you see today, you obviously can grab, but don't feel like you have to furiously write them down. We'll be sending a follow-up email with any links and resources that you see here today. And we'll give folks just 1 or 2 more minutes and then we'll jump in here. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We are going to go ahead and get started. Again, just please stay muted during the conversation so we don't have lots of background noise going on, and so everyone can hear well. If you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. We'll have a Q&A section at the end of the presentation. And again, we'll share all of the links referenced today and any resources that folks request in a follow-up email. And if you signed up to attend the Zoom meeting today, then you're already on the email list. So we'll make sure that you get that. So don't worry about writing them down. Let's go ahead and get started. So we're here today to talk about two constitutional initiatives, Constitutional Initiative 126 and 127, both focused on reforming Montana's elections and restoring freedom, choice, and accountability to Montana's elections. I'm really happy tonight. Well, let me first introduce myself. I'm Noah Marion. I'm the Political and State Policy Director for Wild Montana and for Wild Montana Action Fund. And I'm really excited that we have an expert here to talk with us tonight in Kendra Miller, who's with Montanans for Elections Reform. And Kendra's going to share lots of great information with us about these initiatives today. I'm going to just get started by just a quick overview of the basics. CI-126 is a constitutional initiative that creates a top 4 open primary system. And this open primary system will allow candidates for a specific office to be listed on the same primary ballot instead of separate partisan ballots. I'm sure lots of us have gotten our primary ballots in the mail already, and you'll notice that in some cases there's 4 different ballots and you have to choose one of them. This would put everyone on those ballots on one ballot, and you get to choose whoever you'd like. So you select a single candidate to vote for from the large list, and the top 4 overall vote getters, regardless of party, advance to the general election ballot. This initiative is going to enable and encourage voters to split their tickets, casting their votes based on candidates rather than party. Lots of us know that ticket splitting has a really long history in Montana general elections, but it's currently impossible in primary elections because voters can only vote on a single party ballot. It also shifts power away from political parties and the more extreme electorate that votes in the primary to the more kind of moderate voters that participate in the general election. The second initiative is CI-127. And it requires a majority winner in the general election, meaning a candidate must receive over 50% of the vote to be elected. If the initiative passes, the 2025 state legislature will be responsible for choosing the method of reaching a majority winner. There's pretty much essentially 2 methods to satisfy that requirement. If no candidate gets 50% of the vote, we would either use an instant runoff voting system like in Alaska, or an additional runoff election held in late November or December between the top 2 candidates, like we see in Georgia, to reach a majority winner. Together, these initiatives create more choice for voters, more competition among candidates, more freedom to select whichever candidate a voter prefers across all contests, and more effective and accountable government for all Montanans. They also create a viable pathway for independent candidates not tied to political party structures to achieve electoral success. For these reasons, and for more you'll hear today, both Wild Montana and Wild Montana Action Fund have endorsed these initiatives and are working to pass them, to qualify them for the ballot and pass them in November. I'm going to pass it over to Kendra to do kind of a deeper dive on the 2 initiatives and the impact that we might expect. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so Kendra can share hers.
Thanks, Noah. Okay. I am just going to pull up my slides and I'll jump right in. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm a senior advisor to Montanans for Election Reform, which is a bipartisan organization that formed officially last summer in time to submit these 2 initiatives and start the work to get them on the 2024 November ballot. But really it was, there was a lot of sort of prior coalition work that was happening amongst Democrats, Republicans, independents who are increasingly concerned about some of the indications of democracy failing across the country, and how primary elections in particular impact incentive structures and essentially are negatively impacting the state of Montana and how elected officials govern. So I'll jump right into sort of why we came together and wanted to work on these particular initiatives, why we chose these two initiatives and what they do. Our general sort of overarching goals, we are a bipartisan coalition, and that's really hard to do in today's day and age. But we're united by a few sort of common goals where we could truly work together on this, and that's to improve representation, increase competition, and reduce divisiveness in politics, which is sort of what we've come to know as the only way that we can do things. And the reality is that in some areas of the country, in places where they've looked at electoral reforms like these, we can see that there is sort of a better path. There are ways to move away from polarization and divisiveness, and these are sort of proven reforms. Protect your right to have the freedom to choose who you want to vote for in every single race and every single election, and that includes the primaries. So you can do that in the general election, but as we'll get to in upcoming slides, primary elections in Montana are increasingly the most consequential election that we have in a whole lot of races. And right now in the primary election, you have to choose one ballot and only vote for candidates of that party up and down the ticket. I live in Montana 1 in Bozeman, and so I got four different primary election ballots this cycle, and I have to choose one and only vote that ballot. If you live in Montana 2, you got 3. And then put Montanans back in charge of our election system, resulting in more accountability of our elected officials and thus better governing. And I'll get into more of why on the next couple slides. So why do we need these initiatives? Our current election system doesn't really reflect what I would consider Montana values, and really doesn't reflect what the electorate, in a lot of cases, what the values of this sort of overarching electorate are. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that we're sort of, because our primary system is so influential and so consequential, the sort of power structure of how we hold a lot of elected officials accountable in safe red seats or in safe blue seats is that their accountability structure is the primary electorate only. That is a really small turnout electorate. Not everyone is voting, not everyone is paying attention. And again, it's a subset of people who had to choose one ballot. And so we sort of end up with elected officials who often are only listening to their primary electorates and not their entire district. And that's not really a good reflection of Montana. We can fix it though. And that's why I'm sort of excited and to work on these measures in particular and to bring them to you and talk about them tonight with you. So why did I get involved in this? We have a lot of really concerning problems happening in our in politics today, things that are at an all-time high. And I have links here, so when we send these out, you can actually look at the sort of studies and background on this, but things that are at an all-time high: political polarization, political violence, geographic polarization, which is a big part of why and how I got involved with this, concerns about how geographically polarized we are and how we have red Montana and blue Montana and a decreasing number of competitive seats in the general election. The distribution and reach of misinformation, and then things that are at an all-time low: trust in government, and districts that are competitive. And so I have here a stat that's specifically for Montana legislative races. In the last election, 36 legislative candidates across the state, that's over a quarter of all the races, didn't have any opponent in the general election. And, one solution to that is, well, we just need more people to run. People aren't stepping up and running, but why aren't people stepping up and running? And, in some cases, it's because of how sort of toxic and polarized politics have become. It takes a lot for folks to step up and run and serve in Helena, and I greatly respect those who do that. But also, if a district is, overwhelmingly slanted towards one party or the other, the real competition is happening in the primary, and part of what these reforms do is essentially push that competition on to the November election when more people are voting. It's a more diverse group of people, and it's a better reflection of sort of who actually lives in these districts and who are Montanans. So this stat over here on the right sort of gets to the heart of what we're trying to fix, the problem that we're trying to fix with CI-126 in particular, which is the one that impacts our primary elections. In 2022, across the country, only 8% of US voters effectively elected 83% of Congress. That's a pretty shocking statistic, but it gets both to the fact that we have really, really red seats and really blue seats. And so most in a whole host of seats across the country, they're not sort of in a competitive range. They're decided by so much in a general election that we wouldn't even consider them, seriously competitive. So the only competition is happening in the primary. And then we have such a small number of people casting ballots in those primary elections. And then what happens if there is no primary opponent, right? If someone doesn't have a primary election. So when you calculate that all down to like the people who are actually casting meaningful votes for Congress, it's only 8% of US voters. My background most recently was serving on the Districting and Apportionment Commission as one of the 5 appointees. So I worked really closely with like small scale geographic vote counting and looking at the data and where votes come from. So I calculated this for Montana, and the stat for the Montana legislature is actually worse. It's 6% of Montana voters that effectively elect 88% of our state house. So that sort of gets to the problem. As I said, as it noted on the last slide in red, we can actually fix part of this. These are not solutions that fix everything that I noted was going wrong in politics. These are not a magic wand by any means. And we need a whole lot of things to be happening to move Montana in a better direction. But these are proven solutions and good fixes that can move us in a positive direction. And that's why I chose to get involved in this. CI-126 is the top 4 initiative. It opens the Montana primary election to allow all voters to choose from all qualified candidates in the primary, regardless of party affiliation. So right now we have either you could call it a semi-open primary system or a semi-closed, however you want to look at it, but you do have to choose a ballot. So any registered voter can decide which partisan ballot to choose, but they have to choose one and only vote for candidates of that party. And this would change that. It would put everyone on the same ballot, and you would choose from race to race. You only vote for one person in the primary election. But if you wanted to vote for a Democrat for U.S. Senate and a Republican for U.S. Congress and all the way down the ballot, you would choose every single time who you want to vote for and make sure that your vote counts in a meaningful way. From there, up to 4 candidates who receive the most votes could move on to the November election. If there aren't 4 candidates, then only 2 or 3 might move on, and that might be the case in, say, legislative elections. You might not always have 4 candidates, but in larger scale races where often more than 4 people run across all the different party affiliations, you would often get up 4 candidates. They can be of any party, and so in a really red district in eastern Montana, you might have 2 Republicans or even 3 Republicans move on. But that does actually enhance competition. It ensures that there is some competition in November for the people in those districts to vote on. CI-127 is the majority winner initiative, so it's sort of a complementary measure. These 2 measures have to be separated. You cannot, in Montana, we have a strict single subject law, so you cannot log roll and put them both into one. CI-126 impacts the primary election, and CI-127 impacts the general election, so they have to be separated out. But CI-127 would require that the ultimate winner gets an outright majority, so 50% of the vote plus 1. It ensures that every winner every time is going to have an actual majority of support from their district, and it does not specify the mechanism. So One of the options is an instant runoff system where you would be doing the ranking on the November ballot right then and there. If my candidate, my first choice, doesn't make it to the top two, then who is my second choice, and moving down. Or it could be a separate runoff election. But in the end, candidates are incentivized. If you know you have to get a majority, candidates are incentivized to campaign to talk to represent an actual majority of their entire district or their general election electorate, instead of just sort of pandering to a specific audience in a primary election, if that's the only election that you know matters, which is sort of the current structure of how things work. So these reforms are constitutional. It is not at all lost on me how important the Montana Constitution is, and how significant an ask it is of Montanans to change our Constitution. But I want to also acknowledge that this was an intentional decision to make these constitutional initiatives. And it is because it is essentially for good reasons in our minds. It's that if we are able to pass these initiatives and put them into the Montana Constitution, it restricts, it extremely limits the power of the legislature to essentially do something that's not within the will of the people. These initiatives will be decided on by all Montanans through a ballot initiative process, which I think is the way it should be. And it is important that they are not just statutory, and that the legislature essentially can't just roll back any part of it that they don't particularly like. Excuse me. Every single elected official right now was elected under the current system, not this new system. And so it makes sense that these changes might seem scary to the people in power. They like the system that elected them last time. And so if we're going to make a change like this, which I think are really good changes for the state of Montana and the way we elect people, it's going to have to come from the people. We should not expect for elected officials to change the system that they already got elected under. We won a Supreme Court case already unanimously, just to get CI-126 specifically to the ballot. And so we're really proud of that. And we feel like the case law that was developed during that is, really stands behind the work that we're doing, and the fact that the Supreme Court, again, unanimously 7-0 decided that this is an appropriate issue to go to the people of Montana to decide. So what will change if these initiatives pass? These reforms don't benefit either party. They increase competition by allowing more candidates, regardless of party, to advance to the general election. So in all of those legislative races that I noted earlier, last cycle in Montana, were totally unopposed in November. The likelihood that you would see some competition, even if it's intra-party, but basically more than one candidate appear on the November ballot, becomes much higher. We've also seen, and I'll jump to in the next section where I talk about another state that has enacted similar reforms. They've also seen more independents run. They essentially saw more candidates in general jump in and run in a new system where it seemed like decisions weren't going to just be made by parties or in primaries. They actually just saw an increase in the people who stepped up to the plate to run and wanted to run in this new system. They undercut extremism and polarization by requiring candidates to build broad coalitions across the entire electorate. So that majority winner piece, which is sort of a little bit, it's not quite as simple to understand or acknowledge why we need it, I think, because, and we found in our own work talking to voters about this, that most people already think that you have to have a majority to win in Montana. You don't. You can win with a plurality. And so by requiring candidates to have to earn majority support, you're sort of already incentivizing a new structure where they have to build these broad coalitions. These reforms also change the incentive structure for elected officials by shifting the power from a low turnout June primary electorate to the much higher turnout, more diverse November electorate. So in some ways, a way to think about it is that these reforms don't necessarily change which party gets elected. And there's actually evidence of that, that they don't have a massive impact on sort of shifting politics in a rightward or a leftward direction. But they do change the way that elected officials behave. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a future slide, where we saw that really clearly happen in the state legislature in Alaska. So, the way elected officials behave is impacted right now by the fact that most people in Helena believe that, and I think accurately believe that their primary election was the most important election. It was the election they needed to get passed. And many don't feel like the general election is actually a competitive election, and that impacts the way they behave, and whether or not essentially they're willing to work across the aisle or sort of work for the betterment of Montana versus towing a party line. Independent-minded voters don't have to choose a partisan ballot in the primary, and just essentially giving voters more freedom and choice to vote for whomever they want. We know these work because we aren't the first state to try it. So Alaska is a state that enacted very similar reforms in 2020. There are a number of other states and other municipalities across the country that have sort of parts of these reforms, but not both together in this way. And so Alaska is the best example that we have. I think what's really telling about Alaska, in the center of this slide at the top, the first thing they saw is that in that primary election, they have a top 4 open primary now. And so in 2022, in that first primary election, they saw that more than 50%, over a majority of Alaskans actually voted across party lines. So they split their ticket in the primary election. Montana and the rest of the country have seen massive declines in ticket splitting over the last couple cycles. I find it a really discouraging trend. And as Noah said at the top, years ago in Montana was kind of known for a lot, like really wide ranges of ticket splitting, and we've seen less and less of that. And so these reforms in Alaska were sort of a revitalizing feature, where we saw that return immediately, essentially, when Alaskans were allowed to vote for whomever they wanted to in the primary. So I think that's a really positive trend, just people voting for the candidate more. In addition, they had three major statewide races up that year, 2 federal and 1 for governor. And what we saw in Alaska is that not that one party benefited or the other, or that one person went home happy and is got every single candidate they wanted elected. In fact, I probably wouldn't have voted for all 3 of these. But what we found out is that voters are actually a little more complicated or complex than we would realize in highly polarized atmospheres like Montana and other states that don't have these systems. And the exact same electorate elected one of the most centrist Republican U.S. senators in the country, Lisa Murkowski, who had drawn a lot of ire from the president for rebuking him after January 6th. They elected the exact same electorate, elected a Democrat and the first Alaska Native to Congress, and they elected a very conservative Republican governor who was endorsed by Trump. All 3 of those very sort of unique, broad characteristics, which I think folks in Alaska would say is a better reflection than simply everyone sort of towing the party line and those November elections not having that same level of competition. So not everyone was happy with every outcome. And yet the fact that voters were making conscious decisions about who they liked on a candidate basis instead of just sort of a polarized partisan basis, I see as a positive. Maybe even more telling about how these reforms can impact behavior is that Republicans won both chambers of the Alaska legislature, as they have held them for a number of years. But because of the new incentive structure and the fact that primaries are sort of less impactful and that November election is more important, the group of people who went to the state capitol actually formed a bipartisan coalition where they elected leadership together, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats. So essentially they caucused, which would be basically unheard of in Montana. In Montana and other states, typically it's to the winner goes the spoils. Whichever party controls the chamber, they decide, they appoint all the committee heads, they have the Speaker of the House and on down, and then you have majority leadership and minority leadership. And what they did in Alaska is they actually formed a bipartisan set of leadership, and they made a lot of agreements up front about bills that they thought were a waste of everyone's time and were sort of polarizing and toxic and being pushed by out-of-state interests. And they said, we're going to kill those in committee. We don't want them on the floor. We don't want them wasting people's time when we have really important sort of kitchen table issues to talk about that are impacting all Alaskans. Energy costs, education, housing, things that I think most people would consider the issues that we expect elected officials to be dealing with and stepping up to deal with. And, often in a polarized partisan atmosphere, bills are used just to sort of, force people to take votes on them, primary them after the fact, things like that. Lots of sort of games that are not in the best interest of the people of Alaska in this case, or Montana. So these are just the last couple slides, sort of how we talk about these reforms and what's important to people. So sort of our top messaging are these reforms allow more freedom and independence. Open primaries give every Montanan, regardless of their party affiliation, the freedom to vote for the candidate they believe is best. That allows people who want to vote a straight ticket to do just that. No one's saying you have to do anything differently, but it gives voters the opportunity to make that decision rather than having being restricted in the primary election to not have a choice. More choice, they empower voters. Ultimately, it ensures it allowed for there to be more choice in the November election as well. So with more candidates advancing up to 4, there's often just more choice in general for the voters at the ballot box in November, and then more accountable leadership. So, if the entire district is able to hold a elected official accountable, and all of the votes in that November electorate matter, that's going to have an impact on how elected officials govern. And then that's just a shorter version of the last slide, but I will happily jump to, is it questions next, Noah, or did you have another section? And I see there's a couple in the chat that I will take a look at. I can pass it over to you and I'll look at the chat, but I have a hard time checking the chat while I'm talking, so I can take a look at those now.
Yeah, it's hard to look at the chat. I have a couple more slides I'm just going to share. Let's see. All right, can folks see that? Perfect. Cool. So I just want to talk about, why this matters for conservation. Like, why is Wild Montana and Wild Montana Action Fund getting involved in electoral reform? They may initially seem kind of outside the scope of a conservation organization, but they are critical to our success over the long term, in our goal of keeping Montana wild and protecting wild public lands and waters all across the state. We know that public lands conservation resonates with a majority of Montanans across the political spectrum. However, our current electoral system, like Kendra said, many of those races are decided in the primary election, dominated by more extreme viewpoints and the issues and positions that matter to that really small subset of voters. That disconnect really reduces our power, our collective power, and our ability to hold our elected officials accountable. When those office holders and those elected officials feel kind of more beholden to a small minority of the most extreme members of their electorate, they are less responsive to their constituents more broadly and less likely to prioritize and align along the issues that matter to them, like public lands and conservation and public access and all the things that we really care about. Like I said, a majority of Montanans support all across the political spectrum. Independents, Democrats, Republicans support public lands. However, in this current system, yeah, with those races decided in the primary, um, a lot of anti-public lands positions are taken by our elected officials because they're being elected by this small subset of voters. Um, so that means that, although 87% of Montana voters have said in recent polling that that public lands issues influence how they cast their ballot, elected officials don't feel like they have to uphold those values to get reelected, which makes it harder for us to effectively advocate for our issues once they're in office, because they don't feel beholden to that broader viewpoint. Um, I think Kendra mentioned this, but 61% of Montana voters did not participate in the last primary election, yet dozens of those races were decided in the primary. Um, Many of those districts had such a heavy partisan lean that the general election wasn't competitive. And yeah, that's really, it makes our job protecting public lands and building support among our elected officials for our campaigns more difficult. It's bad for our democracy and it's bad for public lands. Um, and giving Montanans more freedom to vote for candidates, no matter of their party, that align with our public lands values, helps us hold our elected officials accountable and ensure that they adequately represent the desire of their constituents and support public lands issues once they're in office. And I'll just share a quick story. I also am our lobbyist in the state legislature, so I see this in action all of the time. I can't tell you how many times I have gone up to legislators and asked them to support or oppose a bill. And they tell me, I believe in this. I would really like to support it. But if I do this, I'm going to be primaried and I'm going to lose my seat. And so they feel beholden to those primary voters and to perhaps political party officials, instead of representing their district more broadly and what they know is right. And so we see a lot of that, and I'm really excited to see where these reforms might take us and allow our elected officials to really support public lands values in a much more broad way and really reject the extremism that has led to, the movement to transfer and sell public lands, to shut off access to our lands, to privatize wildlife, and all of the kind of big threats that we've seen in Montana over the last decade. Um, so, quickly, just want to talk about how you can help, and then we'll get to some questions and answers, a question and answer session, excuse me. You can visit wildmontanaaction.org/election reform. There's a lot of information on that site, and you can also sign up there to stay informed, and also learn about lots of volunteer opportunities to help us both qualify these initiatives for the November ballot and help us pass them in November. And specifically wanted to call out, we have a couple of volunteer days of action in Butte on May 22nd and May 29th.